attention, and we'll just go for 5, 4, and you can just set it down now, and you can begin. Okay?
Okay. My name is Bertie Maarsen, and I was born in the center of Amsterdam, Holland, in 1936. And when the war broke out in 1940, by that time my parents had divorced, and I lived with my mother in the southern part of Amsterdam. My father was a lawyer, and he had remarried, and he remarried a lady who was came from a Catholic family, and so his marriage was considered by the Germans a mixed marriage. And I lived with my mother. I was at that time an only child. She was an stay-home mom, and we had really a very not too exciting lifestyle. We didn't go out an awful lot. I have to stop.
We'll stop a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go.
By the time that 1940 came around and the Germans invaded Holland in May of 1940, I was 4 years old. I didn't go to preschool, and a couple years later, when I was supposed to go to elementary school at age 6, I was not allowed to go to school because I was Jewish. It was in Holland this situation that if children went to school and were at school, they would be transferred to an all-Jewish school. And well, in my case, I never went to school. Fortunately, I could read at a very early age, probably around age 4 or 5, but I couldn't write yet. And of course, having no schooling, it's kind of disconcerting because you don't have any friends, and it's just was very hard. In 1940, things in Holland weren't as bad as they were in other countries, because apparently Germany kind of considered Holland almost like another province. And they left the people who were running the country kind of by themselves to run the country, and had more an oversight position. The first year or so, not a lot of things happened, but little by little, just like in Germany, people were not allowed to teach. Doctors were not allowed to see non-Jewish patients. People all over lost their livelihood. In my case, my father was a lawyer, and he had his clients, and he felt that probably because he was married to a non-Jewish lady, he was protected. For a while that did work, but his family, my father's family, he came out of a family of 6. He was the oldest boy. His parents first had 3 girls, and then they had 3 boys. And my father didn't trust the situation at all. One of the reasons was probably because, being a lawyer, he had as his clients a lot of German Jews who came from Germany and settled in Holland, thinking that things would be better in the late 30s. So he was very familiar with the situation that was in Germany, and he tried to persuade his sisters and brothers to go into hiding. It did work with some of them. Actually, we lost, during the war, we lost my grandmother and grandfather, both of natural causes, but that were brought on really by the situation of the war. My grandmother, in fact, died of diabetes and and breast cancer. And one of the reasons was that she died very early in the war years, was that they couldn't get any insulin anymore from England. And so she died of that. And then my grandfather could not handle it being cooped up in a place and became very senile. And he died of natural causes also, I think, in about 1942. My father was still practicing law in early 1943. He was of a conviction that we all should go into hiding, and so he begged my mother to go into hiding with me, and that he would try to find him a place to go. And she refused, and she said, "We are okay." And one of the reasons she felt that she was not as much in danger was because she looked like Hitler's ideal person, high blonde and blue eyes, and not particularly Jewish looking. And when I now go to schools, I always try to tell them what that means. It means a Mediterranean look. That means Spanish people look that way, Italians look that way, kind of olive-colored skin, dark, a fairly pronounced nose. That is the idea that people have of Jewish people. That it isn't true. We know that now. But in the war, it was very helpful to be blonde and blue-eyed. And it's just a fact. I myself, I had bright red hair, actually like my grandmother, bright red hair and kind of greenish eyes, and didn't look particularly Jewish. I have a cousin who was the same age as I was. Our fathers were brothers. She was very dark hair, typical Jewish looking, and had a far harder time than I had. So my mother, not having a job and not going out a lot, except to go to the grocery store and perhaps go shopping if she had to, with a very subdued and simple lifestyle, she didn't want to put the Star of David on her clothes and mark herself as being Jewish, so she didn't do it. And so she went around for quite a while without the Star of David, when that was the Germans, you had to do that. And apparently we were betrayed. The person in our little street, we were in the southern part of Amsterdam, and just in a small kind of a duplex building. There was somebody in the street who apparently betrayed all the Jewish families within about a mile radius that they knew, and kind of sold them out to the Germans. Why people do that, it is a big question. It might have been a bottle of wine, a loaf of bread, or some kind of other favors. But early January in 1943, in the middle of the night, a truck stopped in front of our house, and there was a banging on the door, and we were ordered to go with the Germans who were standing there. They allowed my mother 5 minutes to pack. I was told to put everything on that I could find, one layer over another. It was bitterly cold, because it can be very, very cold in Holland in January, February. And I was allowed to take one thing to take with me, one toy. I took a doll. That was kind of a special doll. And it is not that important to my life story, but it was part of it. In that time, what your prized possession was a doll with your own hair. And as I had bright, curly, red hair, that really was kind of special to me. So I grabbed that thing, and I don't remember, because I was still young, I was 6 years old, I don't remember if we had a suitcase with us. It's still a question in my mind. I can't ask my mother anymore. I don't know. She probably would have had a small suitcase or something. But we were ordered out of our house, had to leave everything, and we were driven to an interrogation place where they put me in the waiting room and they took my mother into another room. Um, my mother told me after the war she survived, and she did tell me that I was very unruly and very upset, and that I screamed and hollered and didn't want to be separated from her, which of course is a normal reaction, I suppose, uh, because I was frightened. After a while, they interrogated my mother, and she found out that she was there because she didn't wear the Star of David. And the yellow star was ordered by the Germans, so she was in violation. And that is why her papers had a big S on it. And the letter S was for Straf. That means in English punishment. So she was a punishment case because she didn't put the yellow star on her clothes. After the interrogation, we were taken to what they called a theater. And this was a Jewish theater where there were plays and everything else, music. And it was a little bit like a building like the Paramount. I always compare it with the Paramount here because it's one of those vertical theaters with different layers of balconies and levels where you can see the play. There were thousands of people there because what they did in Holland, it's a small country. Holland is about a fourth of the size of the state of Washington. At that time, it had about 15 million people. And they took everybody from all over to that particular place as kind of like a transit, you can say, camp, because we couldn't get out. It was a jail. And so they had taken all the seats out, and there were thousands of people there. So of that episode in that building, I do remember being so young. My memory is not as vivid as somebody who was older, and I think a lot of it is lost, and a lot of it I kind of was able to reconstruct of the story. But I do remember that every evening, all the children in that building, in that theater, had to go across the street. And there was an attic there. And all the children from age about 1.5, 2 years, from the time that they could walk, to teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years old, were brought across the street by the hundreds to go sleep in the attic. While the attic was just a big, empty place with straw on the floor. And we were told to go sleep, and that's what you had to do. And of course, there was a lot of crying because little kids were very, very frightened. The street in front of that theater was just a regular city street that is in the eastern part of Amsterdam, with some streetcars going through it. And those streetcars, apparently for some people, played a role because people kind of disappeared when there was a streetcar going by because the guards couldn't see through the streetcar. In my case, the street was of course empty when hundreds of kids were crossing there. And the first evening that we had to go there, everything was fine. I took my doll with me because that was my prized possession. But when we were upstairs in the attic and there were all these kids there and kids were crying, there was next to me a little girl about 2 years old and just sobbing and so frightened. And so I finally said to her, "Why don't you just take my doll? She'll help you and she'll protect you." And I tried to calm her down, and she was fairly okay. And then the next morning, I let her keep my doll. because she was so distraught. And when we came across the road again and went into the theater, that I remember vividly because they brought us to the upper level of that building. And all I saw was thousands of people. And my mother, I couldn't find, I couldn't see. And then I panicked. And apparently I screamed so hard that my mother heard me downstairs. And of course, thinking about it now as an adult, you think by yourself, why were you so worried? These people couldn't get out. So she was there, but you could have found her. But you don't think that way when you're a 6.5-year-old, so just panic. So my mother heard me and found me, and we spent another day there. She had she was allowed one phone call, and she had called my father and told him that we were in jail there in the theater. And of course my father was shocked. And what I found out from him just a couple years before he died in 1997 he died. Just a couple years before that, I was able to talk with him about it because after the war, like many other parents of people that I talked to, the same thing happened to all of us. Our parents didn't want to talk about it. And but he did tell me that he worked his network. He called his clients, he called his family. Please help. Bertie and her mother are in the jail. We have to get her out. So he tried to get in touch with the underground, which was difficult because this was not his normal clientele. And finally, I think it took him a day, and finally he got into touch with a lady, a student at the University of Amsterdam, who said that she probably could help him. They gave her a picture of me and told her that I had red hair, and they had enough material for her to see what I looked like. And she said she would try. And so the second evening, when I went across the street, before I left, my mother didn't tell me what had transpired on the phone. I was too young. And the only thing she said to me, I want you to be very obedient and do what people tell you. And you have to promise me that. And I said, yes. Further, she didn't say anything. And then when I went across the street to go to the attic, somebody took my hand and said, Bertie? And I said, yes, come with me. So she took me across the street with all the other children, and then it was of course pitch dark, it's dark at night. She took me to a building. These are all kind of brownstone buildings, so they're attached to each other. She took me 2 doors down to the left, where there was a day nursery. It was a daycare center for children. And she knocked on the door, and somebody opened the door there. And she said goodbye to me and left. And so there was kind of a nurse there, and there were hardly any children because it was evening. And I was told to go to bed. And one of the things that kind of now I sometimes think about that I do not remember of the several days that I was in the theater, also not in the nursery, I don't remember eating. I don't remember what I must have had some food, but I do not remember what it was and how it was, where it came from. I have no idea. It mystifies me because memory is selective sometimes. And I was so much in shock by everything that I forgot these kind of trivial things like eating. But anyway, in that night, what I remember of that was that I was told to go in a bed that was too small. Age 6.5, I was very tall for my age. I don't know why that happened because I'm only 5'2" now, but I was very tall. And I didn't really fit in a 3-year crib. And I remember being so uncomfortable, I couldn't stretch my legs, and I thought, why do I have to sleep there? Anyway, I was an upset child, I guess. But by next morning, about 5:30 in the morning, my stepmother came to get me. And later on, I found out that this, what they called the crèche, that is the kind of French-Dutch word for a daycare center, saved hundreds and hundreds of children the same way I was saved by letting kids disappear in the strip from the theater to across the street to the attic. Most of the children who were saved that way went next door where there was a Christian school and disappeared through the back of the buildings, which was a lawn, a yard. They went into the building next door and then out into the street, when it was safe to go, because there were lots of kids going to school there. In my case, my stepmother, she got me early in the morning. She said it was the most frightening day of her whole life because I had no papers. She did. She was non-Jewish. So, but we didn't dare to take the streetcar. This was in the eastern part of Amsterdam. We walked to the middle of Amsterdam. Took us quite a while. It's quite a long distance. And I do remember her pulling on my arm, faster, faster, faster. And we went through little streets, avoided the big streets because there were soldiers, everywhere. And made it to my father's house, which was an apartment on the 3rd floor in the middle of Amsterdam. It's the house where I was born, in fact, situated across from the Heineken Brewery, the old building, and on a canal. And she took me that same afternoon to her sister. I have to stop.
Sure. And continue.
Well, when this happened to me, and I was in the theater still, and they were trying to get me out. My stepmother had made a call to her sister, who, with her brother-in-law and 2 teenage daughters, lived very close to the German border in the eastern part of Holland, about 15 miles from the border there. Her brother-in-law was the postmaster in that small town, and her sister, the conversation that she had with her sister could not have been normal, because the Germans listened in on all the conversations on the phone lines. So I suspect that probably the conversation went a little bit like, "Hello, Joe, this is Will. I wanted to deliver a package to you. I'd like to come tomorrow if that is possible. I offer to bring you that, and I'd like to see you." She knew exactly what was going on, her sister, because I think probably over the years, they talked about this kind of thing, not this happening, but about the war and about the fact that, my stepmother had married a Jewish man. So my stepmother took me in the train, which was also a very risky proposition because I had no papers. And we made it okay. It was about a 2 to 2.5 hour train ride to the eastern part of Holland. And she delivered me to her sister, brother-in-law, and the 2 teenage daughters. I was given a bed in her youngest daughter's bedroom, shared that with her, and I stayed there for 2.5 years. This was in January 1943, and we were liberated in April of 1945. This is the eastern part of Holland, which was liberated by the Canadian Army in that time. Holland is a very small country, as I said, about a fourth of the state of Washington, but the interesting thing is that the country during the war was kind of divided in three zones. The western zone, where all the big cities are, was really occupied by the Nazis and was really the worst. Many of the Jewish children especially survived in the country and in the middle part or in the eastern part. And in the middle part of the country, my father, after this had happened to me and after I was saved from the theater, the Nazis came to his door just a little bit later. I think it was probably a month or 2 months later. They knocked on the door. There was a very long staircase. You have these high staircases in Holland with these brownstone buildings. And so you have a little time. And he had in his house, so the house where I was born, they had a hollow wall. And they had taken something that he could go and move something aside and then go into that area and hide. His wife, my stepmother, was an actress and an opera singer. And that came in very handy because the Germans came up on the staircase and, "Where is your husband?" And she said, "My husband." "My husband? You're talking about my husband? He's a terrible man. He has treated me well." Anyway, she made such a fuss and she gave him such a bad rap, but they didn't believe her. They took her to jail. And so my stepmother spent 2 days in jail. They tried to break her, but it didn't work. All her theatrics, she brought into being there, and it actually saved my father's life. They sent her home after 2 days. They couldn't do a thing with her. And, well, of course, when she came home, my father knew that time was up and he had to disappear. So he apparently, I think they had a car that brought him to the middle part of Holland. It's in a place called Nijmegen. And Nijmegen is very close to Arnhem, where later on the Battle of Arnhem took place. It was a cousin of my stepmother. She had a large family, a large Catholic family. And so they took him in. He was in an attic room for 2 years, almost, a year and a half. And for a person who was as active as my father was, it was really punishment for him because I could go out, I could be in a house, I could go downstairs or upstairs. I couldn't go outside. He couldn't go anywhere. So he was stuck in that attic room. And what saved his life, he told me later, from going insane in there, he started to collect stamps and came out of the war with quite a stamp collection because my stepmother would buy things for him and just kept him busy, kind of. And she went back and forth to Amsterdam, but decided at one point that she better, stay with him. And that was a good decision because very shortly after, you couldn't travel freely from one place to another. So they spent, I think she spent there probably about a year with him. In the meantime, my mother, we left her at the theater as far as my story goes. When I didn't come back the next morning, she just hoped that everything had gone well. And she went to the restroom and tore up her papers and flushed it through the toilet. So she didn't have any papers anymore. So when her turn came to show her papers, she said, "I don't have them. There are too many people here. It's so chaotic. I don't know where they are. I lost them." And what could they do? They just kind of believed her. And he never confronted her about the fact that I had gone, that I was not there. So because she did that, they sent her to Vught. And Vught is a little town in the southern part of Holland. It's kind of also like a transit camp. It was a Dutch camp, not far from, actually, not that far from Amsterdam. While she was there, they punished people by putting them outside in the frost, in the snow, and they had to stand on appel. They called that an appel, where every person was called by name, and if you were called by name, you could go inside. But that took hours because there were hundreds of people there, probably thousands. And one time she stood outside there, and they called her name, and she could go inside, but she was numb. Her feet she didn't feel anything anymore. Her legs and feet were numb. So she was not in the best of condition to climb upon a little stool in order to get to her bed. Her bed was up. There were 2 layers, upstairs and downstairs. And she slipped on the stool, fell, and broke her leg. Well, the Germans didn't have much pity. They left her in her bed for a week. And by that time, her leg was so swollen that it was just horrendous. She was able to contact her fiancé who was in Westerbork at the time. He was a man she was engaged to. He had volunteered to go to Westerbork. He was an accountant. They didn't need him there. And in order to do that, he felt he could save his parents. And so he had been there for a while, and then he heard that she was, she had broken her leg. He finally sent her to Groningen, to the academic hospital. They set her leg and put her in a cast, and then sent her to Westerbork. So they were together there in Westerbork in about the end of February of 1943. They decided to get married in the camp. They felt they had a better chance of surviving, probably, with the 2 of them. So in March, they were married by a minister, a Protestant minister, because my stepfather had been baptized before the war already to be Protestant, and so she went into the same religion. My mother, nor my father, nor my mother were observant. My father went for 1 year to study as a rabbi, and then he went to his Orthodox parents and told them that this was not his cup of tea, and he liked to go to law school. So that's why my father ended up a lawyer, and after the war, he ended up really agnostic. He did not believe in religion anymore. Like many people did after the war, they kind of left their religion. And some of them became more devout. So it depended on the person. I lost my track. I have to stop.
Sure.
So my dad was in hiding in Nijmegen, and that area was liberated in September of 1944 by the American Army, by the parachutists, Battle of Arnhem. And so he was free in the end of September. He was free to go where he wanted, but he couldn't get back to Amsterdam, so he had to stay with his family a while longer. What he did do, though, was he offered himself as an kind of like a counselor to the American Army. He was fluent in English, and to help to be kind of an intermediary between the Dutch government and the American Army who was there. So that gave him something to do, and things, of course, for him were much better. What happened with me, he knew that I was of course, at my aunts and uncle's house. He did not know how I was, because all the communications, like telephones, they were impossible. They were, besides that, when the middle of the country was kind of liberated, there were no communications, there were no phone lines, everything was cut, bridges were gone. I mean, even the roads were not passable. Um, in my hiding time, I was in a large house, and it was one of those. In the Dutch towns, there are really almost always just three big buildings, and one is City Hall, and one is the church, some kind of church, usually Catholic church. And the third big building is always the post office. And the post offices in those small towns in Holland are everything together. That means the front is a post office, upstairs are the bedrooms, in the back are the living quarters for the postmaster. And because it was a large house, and because we were away from the kind of the front, it was fairly easy to hide in. I was not to go near the windows. I had to stay always on the inside. And it happened to have a large yard in the back with a garden with vegetables. They had a lot of red currant bushes, which are not very well known here in the States, I found. But red currant bushes have very dense leaves. They are bare in the winter, but in the summer, they form kind of like a hedge. You can't look through it. And they had hundreds of them. And that was in their yard, and the yard was like an English garden with a brick wall around it that nobody could look through. And so I was allowed in the summertime to go outside and do some work there. And I guess that's where I got my taste of gardening, because I still like it. We grew some vegetables, and they had a big brick, their house was brick, so I could play with my ball against a brick wall, but that was all the movement I could do. I didn't have any friends, and nobody knew I was there. I was actually, they called it later, it was a life of non-existence. Just a couple years ago, one of the teenage girls at that time, she was in her 80s, was still alive, and she mentioned to me, do you remember we had this Christmas party? And she gave me this whole story about this Christmas party. And I said, her name was Han. And I said, Han, you forget one thing. I didn't exist. She said, what do you mean? And I said, I wasn't at that party. There were other people there. Nobody knew I was there. Oh my gosh, I forgot. So that was just a fact. When people came, I had to go upstairs, sit in a chair or sit on a bed or lie on a bed and not move, because they were afraid. It was an older home. When you walked upstairs, you could hear downstairs. And being in a small town and having two teenage daughters, they couldn't go to a store and buy me books, not even from the library, because why do you need children's books? You know, your kids are 15 and 19. You know, that was too dangerous. And so they sewed my clothes. The thing that I didn't have at the end of the war were shoes. It was impossible. They couldn't get me shoes. I had a piece of wood under my feet and with some kind of a leather strap around it. And my sweaters, well, the oldest daughter there, Han, she was a knitter. And she loved to knit, so she would take one of her old sweaters, took the yarn, took it all out, and used that yarn to knit me little sweaters. And I had an example of how strange actually memory works. A couple years ago, she died last year, so it's probably 4 or 5 years ago, I was visiting her. And when I was talking to her and I said, Han, I get this image in front of me. I see this cobalt blue knit sweater, and it has little white doggies on it in Angora, knit in. Well, she said, of course I knit you that. And I said, how come that I think about that now? We're 60 years away from the war. She said, I always knitted animals in your sweaters. That's memory. I'd never thought about that before. But anyway, they kept me close because of sewing and all kinds of things. One of the problems was, of course, to keep me busy. And here I got real lucky because Han, the oldest daughter, had a fiance, and he was an elementary school teacher. And he was one of the very few people who knew that I was there. Of course, he came there often. And he taught me how to write. And he gave me the homework for his kids. So when the kids got in school got homework, I had homework too. So he kept me very much up on things like English, and not English, but Dutch writing, mathematics, a little bit of algebra here and there. But they were elementary school level things. So at least I could read and write. And that has been really a bonus for me in my later school life, that I could at least fit in some way. During my time there, 2.5 years, we had some really kind of fairly dangerous things happening. First of all, we were very close to Germany, and in the last year of the war, we had the V1s and V2s ballistic, or actually they are, what do you call those things? Well, you looked in the sky, you saw this ball moving from one point to another, and the supplies for these kind of missiles, I guess they were loaded upon in a little railroad station very close to our house, and the Allied people they bombed them sometimes. So we had bombs going off and fairly tricky situations. We had sirens going very often. And I've escaped a couple times in very tricky situations. I was once working at a desk near a window, and my aunt called me, and I didn't come right away. And she was very angry with me. She said, "Bertie, when I call you, you have to come immediately." And when she was saying, we heard this big bang, and where it sat, the window had shattered. And we lost a lot of windows that time. Very tricky things. We had we had a lot of airplanes going over, bombing the Ruhr area of Germany, where all the heavy steel fabrications were for their tanks, for their trucks, for whatever. And the Allied bombed them very often during raids at night. And when those happened, the sirens went off in the town, and we hid in a root cellar in the garden. So this was big fun for me. I didn't have that sense of danger that adults had. So you went in your pajamas, you ran through the garden, and then you had to go into some kind of root cellar, and there you sat on the lap of somebody. They always had me on the lap. What I do remember of that root cellar is kind of interesting. I of course visited the place several times after the war. Is the smell. It had a mouse smell, musty, mousy smell, and I still remember that. But it was not a place of fear for me. It was kind of, it was excitement. And then when the raid was over, we could go back home. Sometimes they did not put on the sirens, and sometimes we slept through whatever happened. But then in the morning you could see, you looked outside in the garden, and there were all these aluminum strips on the ground. Apparently this was it had something to do with the radar, to confuse the radar. I used to collect them. I had whole bunches of those things. Another thing was that we were in a big house, and next to us, on the other side of a small street, so across the street, was the headquarters of Seyss Inquart, who is the guy who had actually the command of all of Holland. We were right under their noses. They made my aunt very angry because they had all these young girls sunning themselves on the roof, and we looked right under. And she said, "Here, they're here again." I mean, this was not very accepted at that time. But anyway, the crazy thing is they never asked to searched the place. The only time that we had a fairly close call is when they came to the door in the end of summer, and they said to my aunt, "You have fruit on your trees." She said, "Yes, we do." She said, "We want it." So she said, "There's the ladder, pick it." So we didn't have the fruit, but we had the fact that they didn't come in the house. Now, one of the things that we also had during the war was, of course, I never went out, except 2 times apparently. My cousin Han reminded me of that because I had forgotten. She said we went out twice when there was very little light, very little moon, and they put a big hat over my hair, and we went around the block twice in 2.5 years. That's the only time that I was actually on the street. And I'm sure that my Aunt Jo did not want us to do that, but Han thought that was an adventure. Come on, let's go. But anyway, another thing happened while I was there. It was a family of 4, which I joined. And I was part of their family. I ate with them at the same table. There was nobody who could look into the window from the back because we had a big garden outside and nobody was in there. But somebody joined us, and that was the fiancé, or actually the boyfriend at that time, of the younger daughter, who was about 15, 16. And he was about 6'2" tall, about 17, was ordered to go to Germany, and he didn't want to go. So he went into hiding also in our place. And here is the difference in going into hiding. They didn't know what to do with me because there was not one place in the whole house or anywhere where I could really physically disappear in. So what they did to protect me, they taught me a lot of the Roman Catholic prayers. Because what the Germans did, they would come in a house and they would suspect a child to be Jewish, and they knew that the family was Catholic. And of course, you know the Catholic prayers when you're born into a Catholic household. And so that's what they did. And they also told me that my parents were dead, and they had been killed in the bombardments of Rotterdam at the beginning of the war. So I was an orphan, and they had taken me in. That was the official version. And then, of course, I knew the prayers, so I couldn't be tricked that way. For him, for Oni was his name, when he came to live with us and went into hiding, that was a different story. He had to disappear. So if they would search the house, that they couldn't find him. And so what they did, they in a closet, in a coat closet, or actually in a closet in one of the rooms upstairs, in the bedrooms, they had the ceiling could be moved to the side. And they installed a couple of rings, gym rings, where he could pull himself up in. So if somebody came to the door, that's where he had to go, move it aside, go, use the rings to go into, above the closet, and then put it back. So you couldn't see anything from the outside. So he could physically disappear. And actually he was a very good friend to me, because I told him many, many, many times that after the war we were going to get married. That was my fantasy of age 8 or something. But anyway, he did marry the younger daughter later, after the war, and we did all survive. At the end of the war, the last half year was the hunger winter. In Holland, in the western part, people were punished by the Nazis because some things had happened. Some Germans had been shot or something. And they did the same thing that they actually did with Stalingrad. They killed the population by not feeding them. And so, as it was the most severe winter we have ever had in Holland, a lot of people died. They died on the street. They froze. There was no heat. There was no food, no nothing. That was the winter that people ate tulip bulbs. And that is not a story, that was real life. There is somebody, in fact, living in this Seattle area that who went through that. He's not Jewish, but he was on a farm and they didn't have any food, and he has recipes for cooking tulip bulbs. And I know him very well. He joined me for a talk in his school one time, and so the kids got really kind of an idea of how it went for different population groups. Anyway, little children, the Germans allowed parents to send children to the east. They came in big trucks by the hundreds to the families in the east because that was the kind of the breadbasket of the West. It's full of very fertile lands, big farms, cattle, big farms with vegetables and everything else. So we had enough food in the East. And so the Germans allowed kids to be sent there. So we got a little 3-year-old living with us. So then my aunt and uncle had not a family of 4, but a family of 7. And food was scarce and was rationed. We had rations for 4 people, for 7 people. So what she did was, she was of course the postmaster's wife, which gives you a certain status, in a small town. She took all her linens, she took all her silver, went to the big farms and got us food. And I cannot, when I go to schools, kids always ask me if I was hungry. And I can honestly say never. We could not go to the store and buy chocolate and candy and all this kind of stuff, But we had the basics. We had bread, we had potatoes, we had sometimes vegetables, not too much, what I remember, lots of bacon, lots of eggs and butter and milk. And that's actually all you need to survive on. And that's what my aunt did for us to survive physically. Fortunately, I was healthy. I didn't need a doctor ever in those 2.5 years. And well, that is it. That is my. The worst part was that I didn't have friends, that I couldn't play, that I didn't have school, and that when the war ended in April of 1945, we were liberated by the Canadian Army. That was the worst time for me as far as the war was concerned. It still is affecting my life at this time. I'm very sensitive to noises. When rock music hit my ear, I am hiding. I can't handle it. The Blue Angels are my foes. I hate them. I have very bad reactions actually on it. I worked a couple years ago, or 10 years ago, I worked in Seattle, and I didn't realize that they were practicing the Blue Angels were practicing their routines. And they used to go in between the buildings, the office buildings in Seattle. And I suddenly had this noise and I hit the ground. I was flat on the ground like that. Total gut reaction, of course. And I remember people asking me, "Are you okay?" And I said, yeah. Well, I was totally out of it. That is what I think originates in our liberation there, because the Canadian Army came in, and the Germans, who of course were all powerful in the town, had set up a machine gun in front of the front door. There were grenades exploding all over, and when that started, my aunt and uncle put us all in the basement. That means we had a cellar under the house also. And that cellar she had stocked with food. She was very smart lady, stocked with food so we would have food in case we ever needed to be there, and we were there. And who came over there to sit with us were our neighbors from across the street, because they didn't have any place to hide. They didn't have a basement. And so they must have been really surprised to see me there. But at that time, it didn't matter anymore. And so we all stayed there for several days. And the only time that we were allowed to go out of there was to go to the restroom, in fact. And then my aunt would say, quick, 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 you know. And what I'll never forget is after about 3 days of fighting and a German soldier coming down the staircase into the basement where we were, I never forget that. He came down the staircase and all I saw was bloodied, muddied boots. And he asked my aunt for wine. Do you have some wine, some alcohol for my wounded? And she said, okay. So she gave him everything she had. So he moved up again and left. And it took several days, and the noise was deafening. And we were kind of in a little daylight basement. We had one window, and we put all kind of blankets in there because things were flying around so much. To keep safe, we had to be there. It was in early April. It was Easter, in fact. I think it was Easter Day that we were finally liberated. And then, of course, people went out in the street. And my Aunt Jo said, you are not going out. And I said, but I want to go out. She said, no, 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 you stay inside. She was very smart. There were several people killed that day because there were still snipers from the buildings. They just cut people down left and right. But anyway, after that happened in early April, the Canadian officers came in and asked my aunt if they could have part of the house because they had no place to stay, the officers. Fine. So we moved all in some of the bedrooms, and we gave them a couple of rooms. And that was my couple weeks that I taught them Dutch. Of course, I had to teach them something. And they gave me a very prized possession. And well, when I go to schools, that seems to really get the attention of the school kids. They gave me chocolate. I had seen chocolate for 5 years or 6 years or something. And they gave me a bar of Cadbury chocolate. Dark red wrapper. The wrapper is still the same, by the way. And, well, that lasted me a week. I think I gave people little pieces here and there, and I took some myself. And then, of course, they taught me English. Those were my first English words were, taught there. My aunt, after liberation, in the first week of April, she knew that my father was free in the middle part of Holland. But the big question was, how do we get there? Because all the bridges were blown up. And it was very hard to get somewhere in a straight line. You had to go around, and it was forbidden. I was a civilian, and I was not to move. But by the third week in April, she had found somebody she knew in the army, in the Dutch army, and she asked him if he could get me to my father. And he first said no, and then he said okay, but then I had to sit under a cloth in the back of a jeep. He had to hide me because officially you're not allowed to. And so I did go. I think it took us 2 days to get 100 miles from there. Because the roads were all gone. But anyway, he did deliver me on my 9th birthday on the 22nd of April in Nijmegen to my father. And I'm sure he did not know that I was coming. And it must have been quite emotional for him and for me, of course. I stayed with my stepmother and my father for a little while. We couldn't, Holland was not liberated, the western part was not liberated until May of 1945. And we didn't travel until about June, I guess. And went back to the the house where my father lived and where I was born. And things weren't like they were when they left it, because and the underground and the Germans had lived there. They just squatted all these houses, and you don't know. Anything that was not nailed or big was gone. And they did have their furniture, because in Holland you can't get your furniture off the staircase. It's impossible. It always has to go on the outside of the building. They didn't go through that trouble. But the rest, there was an awful lot gone. But we did have a roof above our heads, which was very important in 1945. I stayed with them for a while, and then they tried to find out what happened to my mother. And of course, the Red Cross had a lot of records, and we found out that she was in Switzerland. And what had happened to my mother, after she joined her fiancé in Westerbork and got married there, they were there for quite a while. They were there much longer than most people. And we have not been able to find out exactly when she was, they went to Theresienstadt, Terezin, to the camp. And I think that was probably in the end of 1943, probably 1944. In Terezin, they had, of course, a very hard time. I don't know an awful lot of it. After the war, when my mother finally came back to Holland, she wanted to talk about it. And I was nine years old, and I didn't want to hear about it. And so, actually, I missed the boat a little there, because it's one of my regrets that I never really talked with her a lot about her camp experience. I know that my stepfather was a fairly heavy and very tall man. He was under 100 pounds when he came from Terezin. They were bought out by the Swiss Red Cross and exchanged for trucks. And that is how I think a couple hundred people were put in a train. And they got a choice. They were asked, did they want to go? And my mother said, when they were talking about it, well, why do we stay here? We die here anyway. We might as well go. Yeah, but how do you know where you're going? Well, they didn't. And she said they just thought they might as well go. And they ended up in St. Gallen in the German part of Switzerland. Were very well taken care of by the Swiss government, were put up in a hotel, got some kind of a mentor family. They got assigned a Swiss family who had volunteered and tried to get back into society again. As it happened, they came back to Holland in about July, August, around that time. They came back from, and of course I hadn't seen my mother in 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years. Didn't recognize her. She was pregnant with my brother, Theo, who was born in October. Didn't really want to be with her. Must have been very, very hard on my mother. But then I liked my father. I loved my father and my stepmother, and I was comfortable there. But, according to the law, she was my, what do you call it? She was my guardian. So I had to live with her. But they didn't have a place to live. So first we lived for about a month in an attic somewhere in the south of Amsterdam. And then we got a house. And that is where my brother was born in October. After my brother was born in October, she contracted typhus, which killed a lot of people in the camps. But there was a carrier in that part of the city, and this man was a milk carrier. So he gave milk to everybody. They would go along with the carts. It took them a while to find out who it was, because a lot of people got sick. She ended up in the hospital with my little brother, who was probably hardly 2 months old. And she survived. So did my brother. And in July, or actually probably in June of 1945, my father felt that I should go to school. And as a matter of fact, they sent me to a public school where anti-Semitism was very rampant, where no teacher cared a darn about a Jewish child who hadn't had any schooling. I was totally asocial, had no idea how to play games. I was good in math and I was good in writing. I could do all those things. That was a plus, but I was a mess. And then on top of that, to have bright red hair in elementary school, carrot top, I was yelled at and I was teased constantly. So by the time that summer vacation came, it became very clear that I couldn't stay in a school like that. And so they looked for another school, and I ended up in September in what they called a Dalton school, which is very similar to Montessori. And it had smaller classes, and it was more, it was more geared towards what kids could do than what kids couldn't do. So that helped me. And then they decided in the 6th grade to hold me over for a year. So actually I did the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th grade. I came into that school in June of 1945 in the 4th grade, so I never had the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and part of the 4th. So I was 3 years, so the 5th, 6th, and 7th grade I did for 3 full years. And then I was tested by my uncle. The brother of my stepfather was a psychologist. He came through the war, he was hidden, and he came out of it okay. In fact, he was a neighbor of Anne Frank, which is kind of interesting. It's the same building where they lived at one time. But he tested me, and he told my parents that the thing they should do for me is put me in the most difficult school they could find in the country. Because I was so hungry for learning. And I think it was kind of a reaction because socially I was not accepted. And that's the thing I could do, and there were a lot of things I couldn't do. So looking at it afterwards from this viewpoint, at my age, I think I lucked out because they listened to him. And they put me in a very difficult gymnasium in Amsterdam, which is still existing. Where I had a lot of languages. We had Latin, Greek, French, German, English, and Dutch. And then, of course, geography, history, algebra, mathematics. Very, very difficult school. I was there for 2 years, and then my family moved. So I couldn't do it anymore. I commuted for a year, but it was too hard. And so I ended up in a Montessori high school. Did very well there. And then I had, after the war, my father being a lawyer and wanted to have his daughter take over from him, I went to law school for 4 years. And that was at the time, we do not have college in Holland. It's kind of, after high school, you have to choose what you want to do. So I was fine there. And I think the learning has helped me kind of cope and kind of wipe away the loss I had because of the war. The lady whom I still think about quite a bit, who helped me escape from the theater, was a student. And apparently she was shot just before the end of the war because she had helped many kids. And I feel now I'm talking in schools, and I'm trying to do that also for her. And that is, I think it came around. Just a minute, yeah, I will shut it off.